It's Christmas Eve, 1945. A two-story wood frame house sits 2 miles north of Fayetteville, West Virginia, near the coal roads and the hush of a small town settling in for the holiday. Inside, 10 Sodder family members are at home. Parents George and Jenny and their children. One son, Joe, is away in the Army. The night is ordinary, until very suddenly, it is not. I'm Elena Marlowe. This is Still Unanswered. Tonight we return to a case that has haunted this country for 8 decades, the disappearance of the 5 Sodder children.
Did 5 children die in a house fire that burned for less than an hour, leaving almost no remains? Or were they taken? And if so, by whom and why? These are the questions the Sodder family asked for the rest of their lives. With me is Dr. Daniel Ferraro, forensic historian and criminology lecturer, who studies mid-20th century arson investigations and immigrant communities in Appalachia. Daniel, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Elena. It's good to be here. The Sodder case is one of those stories that sits right at the intersection of technical evidence and human sorrow. It's not just a mystery of burned timber and missing bones. It's also a story about immigrant identity, local power, and the way grief can shape a lifetime. I'm honored to help walk through it with you.
Let's set the scene. Fayetteville in the 1940s. Small, tight-knit, coal country. People knew one another. Gossip traveled. The Sodders were an Italian immigrant family who had become relatively well off for the area. George, born Giorgio Soddu in Sardinia in 1895, had come to America as a boy, worked on the Pennsylvania railroads, later moved to West Virginia, and built a modest trucking business. Jenny, Cipriani, came from a family that ran a store in Smithers. They raised 10 children in a 2-story frame house on Route 19. Daniel, what matters about that setting when we think about how this case unfolded?
A lot, Elena. First, small towns have very different social mechanics from cities. Power structures are more personal. The insurance agent, the fire chief, the coroner, these are people you bump into at Mass or at the Five and Dime. Second, post-war America had tensions. Immigrants, like the Sodders, were navigating loyalty and identity. George's outspoken anti-Mussolini stance in that environment mattered. It created friction within an otherwise cohesive immigrant community. That friction becomes a thread we watch closely when investigating motive, threats, or retaliation. It doesn't prove anything on its own, but it's context.
Right, and the family itself, the 10 children. To be specific, John, George Jr., Marion, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, Sylvia, and Joe. Joe was away with the Army that night. The 5 younger children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, about 9 or 10, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, would become the missing. Those ages are important. We're going to walk through the night, but before that, George had been threatened, allegedly, by a local insurance man who said something chilling. Your house is going to go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. That same man later served on the coroner's jury. That detail never stopped looking sinister to the family.
It never does, Elena. When you see the same names repeated in positions of authority and in the list of people who had been at odds with the family, you have to ask why. Was it coincidence? Local civic life often means the same small pool of men sit on multiple committees. But in an investigation, a conflict of interest like that should raise red flags and be recorded and explained. In the Sodder case, it wasn't. And that absence of accountability feeds the family's suspicion.
Let's go to that night, December 24th into the 25th, 1945. The family celebrated Christmas Eve. The younger children were allowed to stay up later after Marion brought home small toys from the Five and Dime. At about 10 p.m., the parents assumed the younger kids would go to the attic to sleep. That was their usual arrangement. Around 12:30 a.m., Jenny woke to a phone call. A woman with a laugh she didn't recognize asked for someone Jenny didn't know, and then the call ended with a weird laugh. The lights were still on and the curtains weren't closed, things she expected the children to have done. She turned out lights and went back to bed. Around 1 a.m., she heard a loud thump on the roof, a rolling sound, and then later smelled smoke and found a fire in George's office near the fuse box and the telephone.
A pile of oddities right there. The wrong number call at 12:30, the thump on the roof, the fire's origin near the fuse box and telephone. Each is a small technical detail that could be mundane or decisive. The call might have been a misdial, sure, but in combination with someone, witnesses later said, looking at fuse boxes in the weeks prior, and a man who'd come by earlier pointing at the fuse box and saying it would cause a fire someday. Those are the kinds of patterns that make investigators ask whether there was prior reconnaissance or intent involved.
Some quicker details about the family's immediate response. George and the older sons, John and George Jr., and Marion and little Sylvia escaped the burning house, but the 5 younger children were unaccounted for. Accounts differ on whether John or another sibling actually went up into the attic. John's story shifted over time. Initially, he said he went up and shook his siblings awake. Later, he said he only called up from the stairwell. That change has been the source of much speculation. Then, the night became a series of failures. The house phone line was dead or cut. The family ladder had been moved from its usual spot. The water barrel was frozen, and George's trucks wouldn't start. The house burned down in about 45 minutes.
Those failures are the things that, to a trained eye, signal sabotage or at least suspicious timing. Missing ladder, trucks that fail, the phone line compromised. You can't ignore a cluster like that. We also have to be careful. Post-war winters in West Virginia are cruel. Frozen water barrels are entirely plausible. Equipment can fail. But when multiple independent failures butt up against pre-existing threats and rumors of people watching the house, you get a pattern that warrants deeper examination. The burden, of course, is proof.
The fire department response was slow. Local firefighters used a telephone tree to summon volunteers, and with the holiday and staff shortages, they didn't arrive until morning. Some accounts say as late as 8 a.m., by which point the house had long been reduced to ashes. The coroner's jury ruled the 5 children dead and attributed the fire to faulty wiring. Death certificates were issued on December 30, 1945. But the family didn't accept that verdict.
Which is understandable. From an evidentiary standpoint, there are 2 central puzzles. One, how could 5 children vanish in a house fire and leave practically no recognizable remains? And 2, why were there apparent opportunities for interference, like the missing ladder and the failed vehicles? Experts later noted that even in intense fires, skeletal remains often persist, and the Smithsonian anthropologist who later examined the bone fragments found at the scene said it was very strange that so little was found. So George and Jenny had reasons to doubt the official story.
Let's talk about the post-fire clues. In spring 1946, when snow melted, Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green object in the yard. The family described it as resembling a pineapple bomb, an incendiary device. Jenny had heard that thump on the roof the night of the fire, and Sylvia's find tied in neatly with that memory. There was also a bus driver who later claimed he saw people throwing balls of fire at the house. These aren't ironclad proofs, but they added to the family's fear of arson and deliberate attack.
They did. An incendiary device would explain the quick spread and the fire's origin near the fuse box if the device was thrown against the house. The problem is physical proof. The object Sylvia found is compelling anecdotal evidence, but without clear forensic documentation preserved at the time, it's hard for later investigators to say definitively what it was or whether it caused the blaze. This is a recurring theme in the case. Moments of potential physical evidence that were not collected, documented, or preserved in a way that would satisfy later scientific scrutiny.
And then there were witnesses who said they saw the Sauter children after the fire. One woman at the scene claimed she saw figures, maybe children, looking out of a car as it drove away from the burning house. A different woman said she served breakfast to a group of 4 or 5 children with adults along Route 60 the morning after. Ida Crutchfield, a Charleston hotel owner, later said a group of children and adults of Italian descent spent a late night there within a week of the fire. These accounts, scattered and sometimes given years later, fed the possibility that the children were taken alive.
But we have to weigh reliability. Witness testimony can be powerful, but memory is malleable, especially years after a traumatic event. The hotel owner's account, for instance, came years later, after she had seen photographs of the missing children. That reduces its evidentiary value. Still, multiple independent statements, even if imperfect, do create a fabric of suspicion. For the Sodders, hearing that someone may have seen their children alive again was both hope and fuel for decades of searching.
George and Jenny refused to accept the official conclusion. George bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the ruins to form a memorial garden, despite being told by Chief Morris to leave the site alone for investigators. That act likely obliterated additional physical evidence, but it also underlined the family's emotional state. They couldn't stand to look at the ruins. They then hired a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, who uncovered more oddities. Among them, the insurance agent who had threatened George was on the coroner's jury, and Chief Morris later produced a metal box he said contained a heart found in the ashes. The box contained fresh beef liver. Morris apparently planted it.
That liver incident is one of those moments that erodes public trust. Whether Morris thought he was comforting the family or covering up incompetence, the act of planting unburned meat as human remains is appalling. It suggests either gross negligence or deliberate deception in a small-town official. That alone is enough to justify the family's suspicion that they weren't getting the truth from local authorities.
In 1949, a more formal excavation found several small bone fragments. They were sent to the Smithsonian. Marshall T. Newman examined them and identified lumbar vertebrae from one individual, likely aged 16 to 22. That didn't fit the ages of the missing children. The oldest missing child, Maurice, was 14. Newman also observed that the bones showed no signs of exposure to intense heat and suggested they might have come from the fill dirt used to cover the basement. Tinsley traced that fill to a cemetery near Mount Hope, which could explain stray human bones in the fill. The Smithsonian returned the fragments to George in 1949. Their current whereabouts are unknown.
Those findings are crucial. If the only skeletal fragments identified were inconsistent with the missing children's ages and appeared unburned, then the physical evidence from the site did not support the idea that 5 children had been completely cremated on that spot. And the fact that fill dirt potentially contained earlier remains complicates the matter. Did investigators misinterpret bones that were already in the ground? Or conversely, did someone manipulate the site? We don't have the full chain of custody or strong documentation, and that vacuum breeds competing narratives.
The family took their fight further. They appealed to state officials, the governor, and even wrote to J. Edgar Hoover asking for FBI involvement. Hoover replied that the FBI could help if local authorities requested it, which they did not in any decisive way. 2 West Virginia legislative hearings were held in 1950, but state officials later declared the case hopeless and effectively closed it. The family kept looking. They put up an enormous billboard in the 1950s along the highway with photos of the 5 missing children and the question, kidnapped, murdered, or alive. They offered rewards, $5,000, later $10,000, and the billboard remained until after Jenny's death in 1989.
That billboard is a powerful artifact. It transformed private grief into public insistence. For decades, travelers saw those photos and the question. For investigators, it was a reminder that some families refuse to accept tidy official narratives. It also served a practical purpose. It kept the case in the public eye and generated leads, real or false. George spent years traveling, chasing rumors, from St. Louis to Texas to Florida, trying to follow every thread. That kind of relentless search often turns up nothing, but occasionally produces something intriguing, like the photograph Jenny received in the 1960s.
Yes. In the 1960s, Jenny received an unsigned photograph postmarked from Kentucky. It was a black and white portrait of a man in his 20s. On the back, someone had written Louis Sodder,
along with a few other scribbles. Fragments like, "I love Brother Frankie," and a number that might have been an identifier. The man resembled how Louis might have looked as an adult. Similar eyes, jaw. The family added that photo to the billboard. They then hired a private detective to track it down. The detective, according to family accounts, took the job and then disappeared, never to be heard from again. That episode became one of the eeriest moments in the long arc of this case.
It did. The photograph has tantalizing qualities, resemblance, an ambiguous message, but without provenance, it's impossible to verify. The disappearance of the private detective adds a layer of menace, though we lack documentation beyond family testimony. And that is the pattern here, compelling fragments that raise as many questions as they answer. From a historian's perspective, we can catalog them, weigh their internal coherence, and place them in the broader context of post-war America and small-town authority. But we cannot conjure a definitive narrative that the evidence simply doesn't support.
We should walk through the main theories, which you and I have both looked at in detail. Theory 1. The children died in the fire, the official position. The supporting facts are the quick, intense blaze, the lack of systematic forensic efforts by local responders, and George bulldozing the site, which likely buried evidence. The challenge is, bones typically don't disappear in a sub-hour house fire. The Smithsonian's findings were inconsistent with 5 cremated children. Daniel, if you had to summarize where that theory stands in light of what we know, how would you put it?
Summarize, cautiously, I'd say it's plausible, but not comfortably convincing. House fires can be devastating and chaotic. Poor firefighting resources, especially on a holiday night in 1945, could result in an incomplete scene processing. The family's bulldozing certainly removed evidence. So technically, it's possible the children perished and the material vanished or was obscured. But scientifically, the absence of more bone fragments, especially in combination with other suspicious facts, leaves reasonable doubt. In short, possible, but there are significant anomalies.
Theory 2 is one that captures a lot of public imagination: arson and kidnapping, perhaps retaliation tied to George's anti-Mussolini views or local grudges, some variant of a mafia or organized crime kidnapping. The supporting pieces: the insurance agent's threat, the strange man who pointed at the fuse box weeks earlier, witnesses who reported seeing a car near the house, the possible incendiary device found in the yard, and the intentional-looking sabotage of escape options that night. The arguments against: why, if it was a mafia-style retaliation, were the parents left alive? Why no ransom demand? And no confirmed proof tying the children to Italy or to criminal organizations. Your take?
That theory has narrative appeal. It's tidy in the way it offers motive and means. The insurance man's threat and the man checking fuses are the kind of prelude you'd expect in an intentional attack. But motive is messy. If someone wanted to punish George, killing him might have been more direct. Kidnapping children is logistically messy and riskier. And organized crime, especially the stereotypical mafia narrative, doesn't easily map onto a small Appalachian town in 1945 without more evidence. So again, plausible in some permutations: abduction for reasons unknown, perhaps by locals who wanted to hide children or otherwise, but it's speculative without corroboration.
Theory 3. Local conspiracy or cover-up. This leans on the fact pattern of officials who mishandled the scene: Chief Morris's liver stunt, the insurance agent on the coroner's jury, and the slow, barely forensic investigation. The idea is that either someone locally caused the fire and people covered for them, or the response was shoddy enough to amount to a cover-up. Daniel?
Cover-ups thrive in small communities where reputations and livelihoods are intertwined. The liver incident alone is an action you don't see unless someone is trying to placate or mislead a grieving family. That suggests conscious concealment, or at least an attempt to manage the narrative. However, a conspiracy with active, coordinated participation across many players requires stronger documentation than we have. In many cases like this, what looks like a conspiracy retrospectively is actually a series of incompetences, poor judgment calls, and protective gestures that collectively look willful. Distinguishing the two is challenging here.
Theory 4 is more psychological, misremembered and mythologized trauma. Over decades, grief can reshape memories and stories. Threats become darker, coincidences align into patterns, and witnesses' memories drift. John changing his account of going into the attic is often cited as an example of how trauma alters recollection. What does that theory add to our understanding?
It adds humility. In forensic history, we have to respect that people remember emotionally charged events imperfectly. Traumatic memories can be fragmented. People reconstruct stories to make sense of loss. That doesn't mean the family's convictions are false. It just means we must be careful when elevating anecdotes to proof. Memory is evidence, yes, but it's a different category from physical evidence or contemporaneous records.
So we end up with rival explanations, none entirely satisfying. Some questions feel like stones at the bottom of a dark pool. How could 5 children vanish with no convincing remains? Who was the woman on the phone at 12:30 a.m.? What exactly caused the thump on the roof? An incendiary device or a falling object? Why was the ladder moved and the phone line compromised? Is the 1960s Louis photograph real, and who sent it? And if the children did survive, why didn't any of them ever come forward? Fear? Shame? Adoption? Assimilation? We don't know. Daniel, I want to ask you about the forensic point that keeps coming up. Bones and heat. How likely is it that a house fire could consume 5 children's bones entirely?
Short answer, very unlikely. Even sustained cremation in a professional crematory leaves calcined bone fragments. House fires can achieve high temperatures locally, but to incinerate all skeletal material of 5 bodies completely would require conditions unusual for a residential blaze, sustained, extremely high heat and exposure that lasts long enough. And remember, the Smithsonian expert who looked at fragments later said it was odd so little material was present. That doesn't prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt, but it does tell us that the complete cremation explanation strains credulity when taken at face value.
When we speak about the human side of this, it becomes unbearable. George bulldozed the site because he couldn't bear the ruins. Jenny wore black for the next 44 years, until she died in 1989. The billboard remained as a public plea and a private wound. Sylvia, the toddler who survived, promised her parents she would never let the story die, and remained deeply involved in the search. She died in 2021. The family literally built their lives around refusing closure they felt was false.
That's the part I keep coming back to, the psychology of lifelong mourning. Some families need a clear, verifiable conclusion to process grief. The Sodders did not get that, and they chose a different response, remnant of protest. The billboard, the rewards, the international inquiries, these became both protective and performative. Protective in that they kept attention on the case, performative in that they insisted publicly that the official story was unacceptable. That stance is not just an emotional reaction, it's a social statement against the failures they perceived in local institutions.
Yeah. By the way, there's a detail I always find chilling. The story that the private investigator who took the Kentucky photo job disappeared. Do we have anything more reliable on that?
We really don't. It's part of the family lore, important and disturbing, but lacks external documentation. The pattern repeats, leads that sound promising, then they peter out. Some ended in dead ends, others in more rumors. That doesn't mean none were legitimate, but incomplete record-keeping and the passage of time make follow-through nearly impossible now.
I want to pause here and ask, Daniel, what about the role of the FBI? The family reached out to J. Edgar Hoover. He said the FBI could help if local authorities requested it. That never happened. How typical was that? Could federal involvement have changed anything?
In 1945, the FBI did get involved in interstate kidnappings upon referral, but the Bureau often deferred to local jurisdictions unless there was clear federal jurisdiction. Hoover's response was predictable: sympathy plus procedural limits. If the local police had actively sought federal aid, or if there had been clear evidence of interstate movement immediately after the fire, the FBI might have opened a file. Could federal resources have made a difference? Possibly, in evidence preservation, witness interviews, and tracking cars across state lines. But given the initial chaos and the family's bulldozing of the site, even federal involvement would have faced significant obstacles.
The case also illuminates the immigrant story in America. George's anti-Mussolini position, speaking out in his community, likely cost him friends. Some witnesses remembered seeing a car watching the children in weeks prior, and the family said local Italian neighbors might have resented George. The post-war political context mattered. It's easy to forget how geopolitics filtered into kitchen tables in small towns. Daniel, how does that dynamic complicate motive analysis?
It complicates it a lot. You can't isolate criminal motive from social context. Immigrant communities during WW2 had strains, loyalties to home countries mixed with newly adopted American identities. An outspoken anti-fascist position might alienate some, make others defensive. But motive here has many plausible vectors: personal grudges, financial arguments, or political clashes. The trouble is that the community's internal tensions are not direct evidence of a crime. They are context that makes certain possibilities more plausible and others less so.
Now, let's talk about the legacy, the billboard, the rewards, the decades of searching. George died in 1969, Jenny died in 1989, and after that, the family removed the billboard. The last sibling to carry the story forward was Sylvia, who promised she would never let the case die, and who kept the family's questions alive well into the 21st century. This case has been revived by online sleuths and true crime communities. Daniel, what's the ethical balance when new investigators and amateur sleuths dive back into cases like this?
It's mixed. On the positive side, renewed attention can unearth overlooked records, jog the memory of witnesses, or surface previously unknown documents. On the negative side, online speculation can solidify rumors as facts, re-traumatize surviving family members, and encourage leaps without evidence. Ethically, we need restraint and a commitment to corroboration. We also must acknowledge that for families, publicity is both a tool and a wound. For the Sodders, public attention was their lifeline, and also a way their pain got replayed again and again.
The core question remains: did the 5 Sodder children die in the fire, or were they taken? It's a question that resists closure, and that, I think, is why this story keeps haunting people. The tension between evidence and hope, between official answers and the family's lived suspicion. Daniel, after reviewing all this material, what do you personally find the most haunting element of the case?
For me, the most haunting element is how ordinary failures, a slow volunteer fire response, the absence of thorough documentation, and officials' bad judgment can transform private tragedy into a public, enduring mystery. Couple that with the human need for answers, and you have a case that the facts alone can't soothe. The liver episode, the billboard, the anonymous photograph, they're all pieces of a puzzle that may never be complete, and that's very hard to accept.
Yeah. Before we close, I want to list the questions that still feel urgent. 1. How could 5 children vanish from a fire scene without convincing remains? 2. Who was the woman on the phone at 12:30 a.m.? 3. What caused the thump on the roof? Was it an incendiary device? 4. Why was the ladder moved, and why did the phone line fail? Coincidence or sabotage? 5. Is the 1960s Louis photo authentic? And who sent it? And finally, if the children survived and assimilated into new lives, why did none ever return? Fear, shame, new families, or something else? These are our remaining stones.
And we may never turn them all over, but they are worth holding up because each one tells us something about how investigations were conducted, how families respond to loss, and how communities remember, or fail to remember, painful events. The Sodder case is not only about 5 missing children, it's about institutional limits and the ways in which grief can force people to become their own investigators.
For listeners who want to learn more, much of the archival detail we've discussed comes from contemporary reporting and later deep dives, including coverage in Smithsonian Magazine, newspaper archives, and the public record around the coroner's hearings and the Smithsonian analysis in 1949. We'll include those sources in our show notes. Daniel, any final thought for people listening who are moved by this case and may be tempted to dig in online?
Be curious, but be careful. Respect living descendants' privacy and understand the difference between verified records and speculation. If you think you have a credible lead, route it through proper channels, local law enforcement, or a historian with experience in archival research. And remember, some questions stay unanswered. Sometimes the most humane act is to hold the silence with care and to honor the people who lived with this wound for decades.
This case is not just a mystery. It's a portrait of a family that refused to let an easy answer be the final one. For George and Jenny Sodder, the absence of remains did not mean acceptance of death certificates. They believed, against the official record, that the story had been interrupted, not ended. It's a heavy thing to carry across a lifetime. Thank you, Daniel, for helping us navigate the facts and the hard questions tonight.
Thank you, Elena, and thanks to your listeners for staying with a difficult story. If anything, the Sodder case teaches us how crucial rigorous investigation and community accountability are when the stakes involve children.
That's all for this episode of Still Unanswered. If this story stayed with you, if you have memories or records we should know about, please reach out, but do so thoughtfully and with an eye toward verified information. We'll keep this story on our list of open questions, because some wounds remain, and some people deserved better answers. I'm Elena Marlowe. Good night.
Good night.